History has many rooms, some filled with triumph, some filled with progress, and some locked for a reason. These are the rooms they told us never to enter. The files stamped with warnings, the case notes written in trembling hands, the experiments carried out in silence and buried in deeper silence. Tonight we open those rooms. Tonight we lift the tarp off the table. And tonight, you will see how far humanity has gone in the name of science. And hey, if you're already uncomfortable, you might as well subscribe. You're clearly one of us now. Let's begin with a truth no one likes to admit. Medicine was never clean, not at the start, and not for a very, very long time. In the earliest civilizations, Egypt, Greece, Babylon, doctors were halfway between healers and gamblers. Every treatment was a risk, every operation a test. But then something changed. There came a moment when humans realized something terrifying. If you want to learn how a body works, you need a body. And if none are volunteering, you take one. The Greeks, yes, the same civilization that gave us democracy, performed early medical studies on wounded soldiers. Not to save them, but to observe how long it took certain wounds to kill. And in ancient China, emperors forced prisoners to swallow herbs, poisons, toxins, just to see which antidotes worked or didn't. These were the first unethical experiments in human history. Tiny sparks that one day would become wildfires. Jump to 18th century Europe, where doctors needed human bodies, and the law said no. And so began the rise of the resurrection men. They stole corpses from fresh graves, sold them to medical schools, and disappeared into foggy nights. But this created a new, disturbing question. If they're digging up the dead for science, how long before they start taking the living? Meet Dr. Marion Sims, celebrated as the father of modern gynecology. But the true story is darker. He operated on enslaved black women, Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, performing experimental surgeries without anesthesia. He claimed they felt less pain. History proved that wrong. But even worse, he operated again and again, dozens of times on some women. Their names were lost. His was celebrated, but not today. During colonial rule, European doctors began treating entire populations like controlled experiments. New drugs, new vaccines, new surgical tools. No consent, no rights, no mercy. To the colonizers, these people weren't patients. They were test groups, disposable, replaceable. No one knows how many suffered. No one knows how many died. Most records were destroyed intentionally. In the 1930s in northeast China, the Japanese Imperial Army built a secret facility, a place where the temperature dropped and morality froze. Unit 731. Officially, Water Purification Department. Unofficially, one of the darkest chapters in human medical history. Inside, prisoners were subjected to freezing tests, disease studies, and biological warfare experiments. Not soldiers, not criminals, civilians. Most never left. Their identities erased, their stories whispered only by winter winds. In the concentration camps of World War II, some doctors abandoned all humanity. They tested drugs. They injected chemicals. They forced extreme temperatures. They mapped pain as if it were just data. These crimes were so severe they led to the Nuremberg Code, the first global rules of medical ethics. In 1932, in Tuskegee, Alabama, Hundreds of black men were told they were being treated for bad blood. They weren't. They were studied as their illness progressed. Even after a cure, penicillin was available. They trusted the doctors. The doctors trusted their data, and the truth stayed buried for 40 years. During the Cold War, the CIA launched a secret project, MKUltra. They tried to break the mind and rebuild it. Drugs, sleep deprivation, sensory overload, isolation, hypnosis. Most files were destroyed. Only fragments remain, enough to prove that the line between medicine and manipulation was crossed. The 1800s should have been an age of progress. Steam engines, telegraphs, great libraries. Humanity was racing forward. But behind the polished brass, inside hospitals, laboratories, and back-alley medical halls, another race had begun, a race to experiment. Doctors wanted breakthroughs, scientists wanted fame, governments wanted results. And the one thing tying them all together? A cold realization. Human life was the cheapest resource available if no one asked questions. Imagine walking into a hospital in 1830. The smell of iron and rot, the sound of coughing echoing through wooden halls. And everywhere, bowls of blood. Doctors believed draining blood cured everything. Fever, pneumonia, depression, childbirth pain. And patients lined up for it, not because it worked, but because they were told to trust the science of the era. History counts over 2 billion medical bloodletting procedures in just a few centuries. People grew weak, people died, and yet the bowl stayed under the surgeon's table, always ready for more. In the early 1900s, surgeons pushed boundaries so far that reality blurred with horror. Dr. Charles Guthrie believed he could control life by controlling the head. He performed experimental head transplants on dogs, grafting one dog's head onto the body of another. The results? Twisting, twitching creatures. Alive, but not alive. Blinded by confusion. Bodies rejecting what didn't belong. These experiments were praised at medical conferences, celebrated as breakthroughs. Few asked, at what cost? If you lived in the 1940s and felt sad, anxious, rebellious, you risked a one-way ticket to the operating table. Doctors claimed the ultimate cure, the lobotomy, a procedure where an ice pick was hammered behind the eye, twisted, and used to sever connections inside the brain. The inventor, Dr. Walter Freeman, performed lobotomies inside trucks he called lobotomobiles. He could complete one in under 10 minutes. Patients came in with depression. They left with blank stares, empty smiles, or never left at all. This wasn't medicine. This was mass personality erasure disguised as treatment. Throughout the 20th century, prisons became laboratories. Inmates were told they were volunteers. But when freedom is already gone, the word volunteer loses its meaning. Companies tested shampoos, perfumes, drugs, chemicals, not on rats, but on men locked behind bars. At Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, thousands of inmates were paid just a few dollars to let researchers inject them, burn them, infect them. They were told it was safe. It wasn't. Children, the most helpless patients of all, became targets. In the early 1900s, some orphanages and mental institutions allowed researchers to use children as test subjects. New vaccines, new surgical tools, new psychological tests. One experiment forced children to undergo spinal punctures, not for treatment, but to observe the reaction. Another used infants as test groups for disease exposure. The justification? They have no families who will complain. When nuclear science exploded into global power, governments wanted to understand radiation's effects on the human body, So they tested it on unsuspecting patients. Cancer patients were injected with plutonium. Pregnant women were fed radioactive iron. Deceased infants, when without parents' consent, had their bones tested for radioactive contamination. All in the name of progress. A chilling memo from the era reads, "These subjects do not need to know. For the greater good, history disagrees." The Cold War wasn't only fought with spies and missiles, but with microbes. Governments released bacteria in subways, on naval ships, and even in entire cities to test biological spread. The people below had no idea. In 1950, the US Navy sprayed bacteria over San Francisco to simulate biological warfare. Hospitals later reported a spike in dangerous infections. One man died. The experiment, classified. The truth, buried for years. By the 60s, the world pretended it had learned its lesson. Ethics committees formed. Medical standards improved. But the shadows stayed dark. New drugs were tested without proper trials. New psychiatric treatments were rushed. Children were still used in secret studies. Mental institutions continued old habits, behind locked doors. It was a quiet horror, a slow heartbeat in the dark, waiting for its next chapter. Finally, when after centuries of mistakes, something changed, researchers spoke out. Whistleblowers exposed cruelty. Journalists uncovered secret experiments. Survivors found the courage to tell their stories. The world listened. International laws were rewritten. Consent became mandatory. Human rights became central to science. But here's the truth. Regulation doesn't erase history. It only prevents its return. And the cost of everything we know today, every pill, every procedure, every breakthrough, was paid by people who never agreed to be part of the experiment. Science has always been fascinated by extreme temperatures. But in the 20th century, curiosity turned lethal. Across several nations, unethical scientists conducted human freezing tests, forcing prisoners, civilians, even soldiers to endure ice water immersion. They wanted to learn how long a human can survive cold. They wanted to measure suffering, like data points. Some victims were revived with boiling water. Others never woke up. And today, these studies are quoted in medical journals, not as horror stories, but as temperature survival data. In the 1940s and 50s, radiation was treated like magic. Governments wanted to know its limits, how much humans could withstand. But instead of using volunteers, they used the vulnerable. Children were fed radiation-laced cereal. Pregnant women were injected with radioactive iron. Hospital patients received doses never meant for the living. These people were told they were receiving treatment, but in reality, they were absorbing the price of scientific ambition. In the mid-1900s, one procedure swept through psychiatry like a storm: the lobotomy. Doctors believed mental illness could be cured by severing connections in the brain, and the tool, often an ice pick. Thousands were lobotomized without consent: children, veterans, depressed mothers, even people who simply misbehaved. Some lost memories, some lost emotions, some lost their lives. And the man who popularized the procedure, he won the Nobel Prize. Some experiments don't use scalpels, they use silence. In several countries throughout the 20th century, orphaned infants were placed in no-touch rooms. No affection, no comfort, no human connection. To study emotional development, many children stopped responding, stopped moving, stopped living. And the researchers wrote in their reports, "Failure to thrive." In the 1960s, a psychologist set out to test obedience. How far would ordinary people go, just because an authority told them to? The volunteers believed they were delivering electric shocks to another person. Irritation level shocks, painful shocks. dangerous shocks. And many went all the way to the highest lethal voltage, not because they were evil, but because the experiment told them to. The real subject was not the man receiving shocks, but the one giving them. Throughout the 20th century, multiple nations conducted chemical warfare tests on their own soldiers. Mustard gas burns, nerve agents, unknown chemicals. Sometimes the soldiers volunteered, believing it was routine testing. They were told it was safe. It wasn't. Some were permanently scarred, others were silenced with paperwork, and many files remain classified. Among the most disturbing chapters in medical history are the twin studies. In the mid-20th century, certain institutions secretly placed twins into separate families, just to study psychological development. The children never knew they were part of a study, never knew they had a twin, never knew they were watched for decades. When the truth finally surfaced, many described it as losing a part of themselves they never knew existed. In hospitals worldwide, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, doctors performed unauthorized autopsies. Bodies of the poor, bodies of minorities, bodies no one would question. Some were used for teaching, others for experiments. Consent was a luxury reserved only for the wealthy. Many people believe unethical experiments are ancient history, but today they simply evolved. Unapproved drugs tested in developing countries, surgeries performed without full consent, genetic procedures disguised as routine treatment. And every time it happens, the world only learns about it years later. All these experiments, ancient to modern, share one truth. Every breakthrough has a cost. Sometimes that cost was courage, sometimes sacrifice, but far too often, it was suffering. And that is why we tell these stories. Not to scare you, not to shock you, but to remind you that science must always answer to humanity. The victims of these experiments will never speak again, but their stories live through us. And if you made it all the way to the end, congratulations. You survived a psychological roller coaster without a medical waiver. So go on, hit that subscribe button, because the next story we uncover is even darker.